the discussion like we do here.
Thank you very much, Nathan. And thank you, Kibbutz Ness, for hosting us. This is very kind of everybody. I was telling you all earlier, and I'll start off this way. I really love Chicago. I was born in Chicago. I got my education in Chicago. I love the city. And in many ways, the book I'm going to be talking about represents my life's work. And I'd like to talk about this book and these ideas with you all. And I'm very grateful that you all are here. I mean, it's a stormy day, it's a dark day out there, and you all are here to hear me talk about this, and I really appreciate that, because we are talking about, I think, something that's really important. So I wrote this book in many ways because I wanted to write a book that would change the way Americans think about immigration in general, and Mexican immigrants in particular. And I really wanted to write a book that I thought young Mexican Americans could read, and that they would see that they have a history of political activism in the United States. And so the book is about Mexican immigrant, not Mexican American really, mostly is Mexican immigrant and in some ways Hispanic immigrant political activism and their assimilation. And what you see up here are of a couple maps. And I'll come back to these maps. But the map on the left there that was drawn from census tracts in 1928 is the map that you will see in just about every published book about Mexicans in Chicago. That map was created by an economist named Paul Taylor, who was at Berkeley, and he used approximations from the census tracts to draw up that map. And from his perspective, those are the places where the Mexicans lived. The map that you see next to that is a map that I created. I'll tell you that map shows that Mexicans weren't just living with other Mexicans, as I'm going to talk about. They were living with Nicaraguans, they were living with Argentines, they were living next to Spaniards, they were living next to all kinds of Spanish-speaking immigrants, and they were spread out throughout Chicago. So you'll see the map on the left and everything else that's been published on Mexican Chicago. The maps on the right are drawn from my research, which I'll talk a little bit more about in detail as we go through the talk. So between 1900 and 1930, roughly maybe 1 million to 1.5 million Mexicans entered the United States. And that sounds like a big number. And usually when I say that number to people, I try to explain to them that that's taking place within the context of the era of European immigration to the United States. So what I mean by that is between 1820 and 1920, roughly 35 to 50 million Europeans came to the United States. And the bulk of those came between 1905 and World War I, when about 700,000 to 1 million Europeans were coming to the United States per year. So as I just said, 1900 to 1930, about 1.5 million Mexicans. 1905 to World War I, 700,000 to more than 1 million Europeans per year. So to give you some sense of comparison, what that means, today Chicago is something like maybe 24-25% foreign born. And for a lot of people, that's pretty shocking. Well, in 1860, before the Civil War even starts, Chicago is more than 50% foreign born, as is San Francisco, as is Milwaukee, as is other states, cities across the United States. And by 1880, if you count the European immigrant foreign born with their children, it's about 79, almost 80% foreign born. So that's how foreign born Chicago was in sort of the time period that we're looking, but these are mostly European immigrants. So when Mexicans begin arriving in Chicago, they are in awe at the diversity of this city, and they start referring to Chicago as Babylon, because they say they're just shocked by the range of languages that they hear walking down the streets of Chicago, because that's how immigrant the city is. So as I'm saying, between 1900 and 1930, about 1 million come in. And these people are all joined together by the fact that they were born in Mexico, so they have Mexican citizenship. That's what sort of brings them together. And by loose commitment to want to go back to their country of origin. And many immigrants often want to work somewhere and then go back to their countries of origin. So that's what binds them together. But ultimately, they are fundamentally divided by the Mexican Revolution of 1910, which was a civil war fought by distinct factions. And what I show in the book is that multiple factions eventually made their way to Chicago. But in the book, I concentrate on a group of Mexicans that I call the liberals, a group that I refer to as the radicals, and a group that I refer to as the traditionalists. And the traditionalists tend to be very devout Catholics. So by the mid-1920s, the Mexican liberals are all settling all around Chicago. And there's a couple images of them. So you have people like Julian Mondragon shown there. He was a journalist in Mexico City, arrives in Chicago and starts working for the Tribune. Next to him, you have Emilia Dominguez, and she was a professional singer in Mexico City. And when she arrives here, she notices that many working class Mexicans are arriving, and they're living very brutal and difficult lives. So together, they start saying, let's create something, let's do something about that. And they start forming first study groups, then fraternal societies, and then newspapers. And their goal is to start providing working class Mexicans with social services. Because this is the era before the New Deal. This is the era before basically we have a welfare state. So they start organizing fundraisers. They start providing some Spanish language and even English language classes to immigrants. Because their idea is, we are arriving here coming out of a revolution that toppled the 35-year dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. So they're arriving here already as social, democratic, revolutionary activists. But these are liberals. They believe in parliamentarian democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. I wouldn't define them as radicals. I mean, they believe in capitalism. They're entrepreneurial in outlook. They're businessmen, they're well educated, and they say we need to start businesses, we need to have market solutions to social problems. But then they add in all of their publications that they're here in Chicago to, in their words, quote, emancipate the people's religious consciousness. Emancipate the people from their religious consciousness. And that is because many of these liberals who participated in the revolution were actually very anti-clerical in their politics. They believed that the Roman Catholic Church had way too much influence in Mexico. It was one of the institutions that they felt was more aligned with Rome than it was aligned with Mexico. And they felt that this institution, this embodiment of medieval antiquity, was actually preventing Mexico from becoming a powerful nation state. So these liberals arrive in Chicago, and they don't go to work with any Catholic church. Some of them will work with the Methodists, and some will start working with the Presbyterians over time, and that is because they feel that Methodist and Presbyterian ministers are more likely to assist them in some of their social welfare work and might question maybe their ideas about Catholicism, but those Methodist and Presbyterian ministers won't necessarily challenge their commitment to returning to Mexico at some point in the future. So they're willing to work with the Protestants because they're that critical of the Catholic Church, and many of them do that. So they start creating social welfare projects in Chicago, educational projects in Chicago. They start forming these larger and larger fraternal societies. But what really bothers them, what irritates them and in many ways offends them, is the way they say many American politicians, intellectuals, and journalists talk about Mexican immigrants. So as you see here, here's some quotes. Really, these liberals are reading what Americans are saying, especially American politicians and intellectuals and journalists, and they're shocked that they're so frequently talked about as primitive people, that they're talked about as people who just don't know much. And then when they start reading the Chicago Daily Tribune, they're shocked at the way the Tribune talks about Mexico. I mean, the Tribune refers to Mexicans as illiterate, as ignorant, as primitive people, and they say even the educated classes are pretty primitive. And they start advocating that the Platt Amendment be extended from the territories that we're starting to occupy in the Caribbean to Mexico. And this is just horrifying to these Mexican liberals who consider themselves these well-educated individuals, sort of revolutionaries. And here they are being talked about in this way. So they start forming study groups, and their idea is we're going to educate our own people, and we're going to educate each other as to how best to deal with this perception of us as a people. And who do they turn to? They turn to revolutionary intellectuals in Mexico who participated in the revolution and who are writing books that are actually changing the way all Latin Americans think of themselves. So they start drawing on Jose Vasconcelos, who publishes The Cosmic Race in 1925, and they start drawing on Isidro Fabela, who publishes The United States Against Liberty in 1920. And Vasconcelos is so important to them because the liberals are arriving in Chicago in the 20s, which is really the heyday of the eugenics movement. So this is a period in US history where the eugenicists are in positions of authority and power in just about every single institution of higher education. And the eugenicist position is that mixed racing leads to biological degeneration. It leads to what they sometimes just call mongrelization. And the Mexicans understand that they are predominantly indigenous or mixed race people, and they see that the eugenicists, people like Charles Davenport at Harvard University, people at the most elite institutions are arguing these positions. They have to figure out a way to combat that, and they don't know how to. But Vasconcelos is combating that in 1925. And Vasconcelos is a philosopher. He's not a biologist. He can't disprove their ideas. And in the 1920s, race is considered, as real as that table. It is scientifically proven that there are races and that the races have fixed biological traits. So what Vasconcelos as a philosopher says in that book, The Cosmic Race, is he takes their ideas and he says, well, if they're right, and all races have fixed traits, and the Mexican has, he says, some of the African, some of the Indian, some of the European, and some of the Asiatic, as he says, well, then the Mexicans have some of the best fixed traits in all of humanity, and they're not an inferior people, as the eugenicists say, but they're actually a superior people, which he poetically refers to as the cosmic race, the race of the future. And he says, we're all moving in the Mexican direction, and so the eugenicists, you better get used to it. And so as he makes these types of statements, the liberals of Chicago just embrace Vasconcelos because he's providing them with a language, with ideas, with a way to combat the high intellectuals of the United States and of Europe who are at this point in time largely eugenicists and agree with the politics of eugenics. So the Mexicans are looking at statements, and they start looking at the history of the United States and the way the United States looks at Mexican people. And they start pulling out of quotes. So here we see Senator John C. Calhoun in the wake of that Mexican-American War. And you see the way he's talking about the possibility of even incorporating the people who were after that war. And from Calhoun's perspective, we shouldn't be incorporating non-white people. The Mexicans are Indians or are composed of children of mixed races. This shouldn't be happening. So the Mexicans are reading statements like this and they're debating them. And they end up debating the way this is all tied to US citizenship. So I often say this in a room full of historians because I find it's most useful to do that. But if I were to ask a room full of historians, like, what's significant about the Declaration of Independence? Well, they all say, all men are created equal. And that's a really profound statement. And that document was written in a particular time. And there's many people who celebrate it for good reasons. But if I ask them, well, what does that First Naturalization Act state? And that's the first Naturalization Act that this government drafts, which is in 1790. So the Declaration of Independence, 1776, the First Naturalization Act, 1790, George Washington himself has to sign it. The first Naturalization Act this country establishes in 1790 explicitly states that you need to be a, quote, free white person, end quote, in order to qualify for US federal citizenship. That's what you need to be, a free white person. So the liberals are talking about this, and they see that at this point in time, US citizenship is bound up with this idea of whiteness, that you need to be defined as a white person by the courts in order to be treated as a first-class citizen. And what the liberals point to is that these papers, these intellectuals clearly see us as primitive people. And liberals start to say, because our color is not white, because our color is bronze, they define us as medieval, primitive, backward, unintellectual people, and they aren't going to treat us as equals here. So they start producing a counter-nationalist narrative. So there's this whole literature out there that says it's in the 1960s that Mexicans start embracing their brownness. They start embracing, it's the Chicano movement of the 1960s that says it's time that we're proud of our Aztec heritage. And one scholar goes so far as to say it's not until the 60s that Mexicans finally start being proud of their mixed race heritage. Well, that's only true if you separate the Mexican-American history from that of Mexican immigrants. Because as I show you, Mexican immigrants in the 1920s start celebrating their brownness as they're embracing Jose Vasconcelos' ideas against the eugenicists. And so there you see them celebrating Cuauhtémoc. There you see them celebrating Leyes Aztecas. These are what they're publishing. These are plays that they're putting on. And the man that they celebrate constantly, who they call their man of bronze color, is Benito Juarez, a Zapotec Indian who becomes the president of Mexico. And for them, Juarez is the embodiment of their ideals. He proves the eugenicists wrong. He proves that you can be a full-blooded Indian, but you can subscribe to liberalism, believe in capitalism, believe in private property, believe in business, believe in entrepreneurship, become a lawyer as he did, and become the president of a country. So they're celebrating having a non-white person as the president of their country in the 1800s. And they say this disproves the eugenicist arguments. We should be proud of our bronze skin. We should be proud of our bronze heritage. Then they start drawing on Fabela to sort of assess all that's taking place in Mexico and Latin America in this time period. And here's where it gets really complicated, because I find the way we talk about immigration is about people coming to us from other places. So they, out there, come here. That's the narrative. They come here. That's our understanding of immigration, because we've put aside or have not wanted to acknowledge the history of us migrating there. So between the 1880s and the Mexican Revolution into the 1920s, thousands of American businessmen migrate into Mexico. Thousands. By 1910, there's over 75,000 Americans living scattered throughout Mexico. And many of these Americans aren't going there to rent apartments or to buy homes. They're going there and they're creating gigantic enterprises. And the irony here is that at my university, I'm often asked to apply to foundations. If you name the foundation, you name the corporation, I can tell you which foundations and corporations can trace all their wealth back to the 1880s when they entered Mexico. So I was told recently you should apply to the Guggenheim Foundation or the Hearst Foundation or the Doheny Foundation. And it's like, if I just take one of those, for example, well, U.S. Senator George Hearst goes into Mexico in the 1880s, and he's followed by his son, William Randolph Hearst. Together they partner with Diaz, and he ends up acquiring over 1.6 million acres of land in Chihuahua, which he uses to run a hugely successful cattle ranching operation, which makes the Hearst family so rich that today I would apply to the Hearsts to study poverty in Mexico and poverty in other parts of the world. And that's the complexity of this, that these Americans are all going there, and they're going there because they're working with the Mexican government in partnership. Diaz's regime sees all of these people like himself. They're interested in business partnerships, and these people are bringing capital there, they're starting businesses there, and they're buying ranches, mines, plantations, oil refineries, and they're starting transportation and communication networks that are all going to actually facilitate, years later, the migration of laborers from there back to here. And so if we want to know why do people come here, I always tell my students, well, the first question we should ask is, have we ever gone there? And if we know that we've gone there, what did we do there? And if we look at what we did there, and if we set up transportation and communication networks to extract natural resources and to sell US manufactured goods, does that then end up playing into the lines of communication and connection that then people from there are using to come back here? And so what the liberals start saying is, we need to insert the Americans in Mexico into the equation. That is, we can't just talk about immigration without talking about the Hearsts, the Stillmans, the Dohenys, all the Rockefellers, Standard Oil, that are all in Mexico. We need to insert them into the conversation. But as they're doing that, they're reading the way Americans are talking about this. And the way some Americans are talking about this is in very aggressive language, which they point out speaks to this way of looking at Mexico as a place to sort of dominate. And so they start quoting the way American journalists and intellectuals keep talking about this. And as you can see, the language here is, the immense national wealth of Mexico only awaits us to get there. The conquest of Mexico is a commercial, if not a political necessity. If we don't go in there, we won't develop it. We need to go. And so as they're making these types of arguments, as the liberals are reading Americans make these types of arguments, as they're assessing the Americans in Mexico, in the Chicago context, the Mexican liberals start befriending Nicaraguans and Puerto Ricans, which is very key to understanding then what starts happening next. Because in Mexico, Mexicans are engaging other Mexicans. But in the Chicago context that I uncovered via naturalization records, I began to see that Mexicans aren't just engaging Mexicans. In the 1920s, they're befriending Puerto Ricans and Nicaraguans. And those two communities start personalizing all of these discussions. They start making these discussions more real. And maybe I'll digress for just a minute and talk about these two maps now to just give you a sense of what I did for the research to uncover Nicaraguans engaging Mexicans in the 1920s, because no other publication out there has talked about that, because they didn't have evidence to talk about that. So one of the questions I had when I wrote the book was, just off the bat, how many Mexicans became Americans in Chicago? I wanted to know the answer to that. How many? And I went to what's called our National Archives and Records Administration, Great Lakes region, which is over here in Pulaski. So I got there and I said, okay, this is my project. I want to know the answer to that question. I'd like 1900 to 1920. And the guy goes, what are you trying to do? I go, I want to know how many Mexicans became Americans in the Chicago area between 1900 and 1940. Can you bring me the first 10 years, 15 years of documents? He goes, I can bring you January 1st of 1900 to January 3rd of 1900. And that's going to be on 3 pallets from about this wall to that wall. He goes, because these are not set up by nationality, they're set up chronologically by date of submission. So you're talking about a city that was 80% foreign born, and these people over time are applying for US citizenship. That's what you're talking about doing. So over the course of a long time, I extracted all the Spanish-speaking immigrants who applied for US citizenship between 1900 and 1940, creating a census of 3,110 Spanish-speaking immigrants, 1,893 of whom are Mexican. To my knowledge, that's the largest and most inclusive historical census of Latino naturalization in the country. And so with that census, I was now able to see for the first time, as that map suggests, all these Central Americans, Hondurans, Nicaraguans living next to Mexicans, Argentines hanging out with Mexicans in the 1920s and the 1930s, Dominicans, Cubans, Spaniards, all associating with each other. And as you can see there by those dots, they're spread out throughout the city. They're spread out. So as those Mexican liberals start befriending Puerto Ricans, like Julio Puente shown there, he was a practicing lawyer in Chicago, and he starts a newspaper here, a Spanish-speaking newspaper, to challenge the way he feels Puerto Rico is treated by the United States. As Mondragon befriends Puente, Puente starts raising more questions for Mondragon about his perspective of the United States. And then as Puente and Mondragon and Dominguez befriend Celio Barreto, everything gets very real, because the Nicaraguan situation in the 1850s to the early 1900s is really intense. So only 2 years after that Mexican-American War, we militarily intervened in 1850 in Nicaragua. Then between 1855 and 1857, there's a series of interventions that all revolve around an American filibuster named William Walker. And then in 1909, we go back to Nicaragua. And this time we go there because we state we're there to protect American economic interests. And we stay from 1909 to roughly 1933. And during that occupation, the New York Times and many liberal newspapers in the United States justify it. They explain it. They say we're there protecting American property interests and there are rebels that need to be put down. Well, Nicaraguans like Celio Barreto, who's friends with this community, disagreed with that interpretation. And he starts publishing articles that start compiling casualty statistics to challenge the United States casualty numbers. He starts publishing statements by the United Nations that challenge the occupation. And he starts actually translating documents from Russian analysts who are saying the United States is doing this as part of a larger strategy of covert warfare to gain spheres of influence in Latin America. So this is the stuff Barreto is publishing. Now the Mexicans start publishing these kind of documents. And basically the Nicaraguans give the entire Hispanic community pause when contemplating becoming a US citizen. And that's what I start demonstrating in the book, that these Mexicans arrive here thinking they're entering into a liberal democracy, and they're pretty excited about it. And then when they start experiencing these ideas of race and these ideas of foreign policy, they become more and more critical over time. And as they befriend Puerto Ricans and Nicaraguans, they become so saddened. Because one of the things that I found that they kept saying, which is pretty profound to think about, which is as critical as they're being, time and again I find the Mexican liberals say this. They say the average American, this is what they say, does not actually set our foreign policy. They say Congress really doesn't even set our foreign policy. It's almost all determined by the executive. And they say, if the average American knew what happened below the United States, they would not agree with this. That's their position. So there's something about it that's so heartbreaking to them, but what they ultimately say is, we can't become American citizens. We do not want to become assimilated into a society that assigns first-class citizenship to white people only, and we cannot assimilate into a society that speaks about us as primitive people and that carries out these types of occupations. So the liberals do not become citizens in significant numbers. They choose not to. So what happens to that liberal community? The Great Depression hits them hard. And in the context of that Great Depression, their businesses start to go bankrupt. They all start losing their financial backing. Since these people are not working with the Catholic Church, small businesses were their bedrock. That's how this community sustained itself. As those go, and as more Mexican workers lose their jobs, the whole community starts to disintegrate. And then in the context of the 1930s, Mexicans are hit with a very aggressive deportation campaign. And the liberals now start to assess that as well. As I mentioned to you guys earlier, between 1900 and 1930, about 1.5 million Mexicans come. The bulk of them really start coming in 1917, because that's when our government starts what's called the Temporary Admissions Program. And that is really one of our first very large government-sanctioned labor contract program designed to recruit Mexicans to come into this country. And our government does that because that historic supply of European immigrant labor has been cut off by World War I. So World War I cuts off that historic supply of European immigration, and our government starts actively recruiting Mexicans in 1917 through the Temporary Admissions Program. And so Mexicans who start seeing these deportations, the liberals, say this just proves to us what we've always known. They do not want us here. We do not belong here, and we might as well go back to Mexico. So a number of them self-repatriate, some of them get deported, and ultimately what you see are the collapse of the liberal community.